Good day, everyone. This is Dr. Soper here, and today I will be discussing the second topic in our series of lessons on information privacy and security, with today's topic focusing on identification and authentication. To begin, consider that one of the foundational principles upon which computer security is built is that of controlled access. What this means is that a user cannot simply do whatever they want. Instead, a user, which might be a person or a system, is granted authorization to perform specific actions on a specific digital asset. As a user of a database, for example, the database administrator might grant you the rights to read, modify, or delete certain data within the database, while other parts of the database may be inaccessible or off-limits to you. A critical point to understand about this controlled access paradigm is that the success or failure of the paradigm hinges on knowing exactly who a person or system really is. That is, if an attacker seeks to impersonate a legitimate user and is successful in their impersonation attempt, then the controlled access paradigm has failed. And this is because the attacker has convinced the system that he or she is a legitimate user and has therefore circumvented our efforts at allowing only authorized parties to perform actions on our digital assets. Impersonation, then, defined, is the act of pretending to be another person or another entity for the purpose of entertainment or fraud. And in the information age, since it is systems that are granting or denying us access to these digital assets, an important question to ask ourselves is, how can a system be certain that you are who you claim to be? Or, in another variation of that question, is it possible for a system to verify with 100% accuracy that you are who you claim to be? As we will see as we proceed through our discussion today, for most of the systems with which we interact, the answer to that question is no. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit more about impersonation, which is also known as a failed authentication attack. One of the important points to understand here is that modern computer systems rely on data in order to recognize users. By contrast, your friends or your neighbors might recognize you through the daily interactions that they have with you, but in order for a computer system to recognize you, you must supply it with certain types of data, examples of which might include usernames, passwords, biometric information like fingerprints, etc. An impersonation or failed authentication attack, then, is successful when a computer system is unable to distinguish between a legitimate user and an imposter because it has been provided with data values that seem to indicate that the user is legitimate. Note here that we call this a failed authentication attack because the purpose of authentication is to prove that a user is who he or she says that he or she is. If an impersonator is able to successfully convince a computer system that he or she is a legitimate user, then the authentication mechanism for that computer system has failed. Before we proceed with the rest of our discussion for today, I'd like to take a moment to define identification and authentication. If you recall, in the discussion of our last topic, I defined these concepts in general terms, and we said that identification was the process of verifying that someone or something is who they say they are, while we said that authentication, in general terms, is the process by which we verify that something is real or genuine or authentic. For our discussion today, however, I would like to define these concepts from the perspective of someone who wants to be recognized by a system. So from the perspective of a user who wants to be recognized by the system, identification is the action or process of asserting one's identity. Authentication, by contrast, is the act of establishing or confirming that one actually is who he or she claims to be. To provide a real-world example which illustrates the difference between these two concepts, consider the process through which you identify and authenticate yourself to a security agent when you go through the security checkpoint at an airport. If you were simply to walk up to the security agent and give him or her your name, then from your perspective, you are identifying yourself. You are telling the agent, "My name is Dan," for example. That is, you are asserting your identity. As you probably know, however, the act of simply asserting your identity is considered insufficient by security agents at the airport, and they will therefore seek to authenticate your claim by checking your state-issued ID card or perhaps your passport. That is, they are unwilling simply to accept that you are who you say you are when you identify yourselves to them, but instead will seek to verify or confirm that you are who you say you are by subjecting you to an authentication process, which, according to current airport security standards, will require that you present some form of government-issued identification. Next, I'd like to talk a bit more about the difference between identification and authentication. Consider first that markers of your identity are often public, well-known, and unprotected. Or if they are not, they are often easy to guess or easy to predict. Examples of these markers might be your name, your email address, your phone number, the user IDs that you use online, etc. And in the world of computer security, we refer to these types of markers as identifiers. If you consider all of the people that you know and all of the people with whom you interact on a regular basis, then you will quickly realize that there are many people in your life who could easily obtain one or more of these identifiers and claim to be you simply by presenting one or more of your identifiers when they are asked. As we saw with our example of the security agent at the airport, using identifiers by themselves as a means of recognizing someone is not a particularly sound practice from a security perspective. Instead of simply asking a user to go through this identification process, then, we commonly also ask users to go through an authentication process. That is, the process wherein we seek to confirm that the user is who he, she, or it claims to be. Whatever methods that we adopt for this authentication purpose should be able to provide reliable recognition of which users are legitimate and which users are illegitimate. And whereas data that is used for identification purposes is often publicly available, data used for authentication purposes should always be kept private. When the authentication process fails, we can classify those failures into two distinct categories. They are either false negatives or false positives. With respect to authentication, a false negative occurs when a system refuses to authenticate a valid identity. Imagine, for example, that you are trying to log into your email account and you provide the correct username and password, and the system still refuses to allow you to log in. That would be an example of a false negative. By contrast, a false positive occurs when a system authenticates an invalid entity. Returning to our email example, if an imposter is able to guess your password and they supply your username and password to the email system will then assume that the imposter is you and will allow him or her to log in and view your emails. This is an example of a false positive. One of the interesting characteristics of authentication systems is that the rates at which false negatives and false positives occur are often linked to each other. If, for example, we would like to decrease the rate of false positives, then by pursuing that objective, we will almost certainly increase the rate at which false negatives occur, and vice versa. Most of us, of course, are very familiar with passwords. From a definitional perspective, a password is an agreed-upon word, phrase, or set of characters that is presumed to be known only by the user and the system. Whenever you create a new password, then, you are essentially entering into an agreement with the system wherein each of you agrees to keep your password secret. If both you and the system are able to keep this promise, and assuming that no one is able to successfully crack your password, then the password can be used as an authentication mechanism. Although passwords are very popular as authentication mechanisms, they nevertheless have certain problems. For example, passwords can be lost or forgotten, either by the user or by the system. Passwords can also be inconvenient. Think for a moment about all of the websites where you have an account. It's not particularly convenient from your perspective as a human being to have to constantly enter your login information and your password whenever you travel from website to website. As another example of password inconvenience, consider this common scenario with which many workers can easily identify. Imagine that you arrive for work in the morning and you log into your computer. Next, you decide to log into your organization's website or portal, wherein you must provide your login information and your password again. After successfully logging into the portal, you may then launch a web-based application that allows you to read your corporate email or internal messages. And there, once again, you may need to enter your login name and password. If you perform these actions in succession, over the course of perhaps 30 seconds to 1 minute, you will need to supply your login name and password a total of 3 times. Certainly not particularly convenient. What's more, passwords are problematical because they can be shared or disclosed to another entity. And this is not just a problem of one human being sharing his or her password or PIN with another human being. On the contrary, it is also possible for passwords to be disclosed by a system. If you're like most people, then you probably use the same password on many of the websites or systems that you use. If one of those systems were to be hacked and your password was to be compromised, then an attacker might easily take that password and use it to log into other websites or systems with which you have an account. Finally, passwords can be revoked, and password revocation can have cascading effects throughout a system. In the next part of our discussion today, I'd like you to put yourself inside the mind of an attacker and to start thinking about ways in which you might be able to acquire someone's password. As we can see here, there are many different ways in which this can be accomplished. One way of acquiring someone's password, for example, is simply to try all possible combinations until we ultimately find the correct password. Another approach would be to try common passwords. That is, we might use common English words, or we might obtain a database of common passwords and try those passwords. A third approach would be to try passwords that are likely for this particular user. We might try to learn a little something about the user and then try passwords that might be family member names, pets' names, birthdays, etc. If we have proper access, we might be able to obtain the person's password simply by searching through the system password file. And of course, the easiest way to acquire someone's password is simply to ask them for it. And this may sound funny, but it is actually a surprisingly effective way of acquiring someone's password. Think, for example, about what have come to be known as phishing attacks, where an attacker creates a website that mimics the appearance of a legitimate website and then sends messages to users of the legitimate website requesting that they log in for some reason or another. The legitimate user then navigates to the phony website, enters his or her login name and password, and has hence enabled the attacker to impersonate the legitimate user on the real website. Note here that as we move from the bottom of this list toward the top, the level of difficulty in successfully obtaining a person's password increases. That is, it's much easier to obtain a person's password simply by asking them for it than it would be to try to obtain that password by using a brute force attack, for example. I would like to point out a few additional problems with password-based authentication systems so that you can avoid them or at least recognize them when you see them. Oftentimes, password-based authentication systems will provide attackers with more information than they should. As an example of this, imagine that you are an attacker who is trying to break into a website. The website asks you to provide a username and password and then click on a login button. If the information that you provided is incorrect, the website might generate an error message which says, "The username that you entered is invalid," or alternatively, "The password that you entered is invalid." Now let's think more carefully about what this information means to an attacker. If the attacker knows that the system will tell him whether or not a particular username is valid, then he can use that information to try different possible combinations until he finds a valid or legitimate username. From a security perspective, a much better error message would be one which reads, "The username or password that you entered is invalid." The attacker could gain no real advantage from this sort of error message because all he would know is that either the username is invalid, the password is invalid, or perhaps both are invalid. The system is not specifically telling him where he made his error, and in that way is more secure. Another example of a security mistake with respect to these authentication systems is for an organization to make its password standards publicly available. For example, imagine that an organization has a policy in which a password must be 8 characters long, must contain at least 1 letter and 1 number, and cannot contain any special characters. Further, assume that this password standard is publicly available on the organization's website. Because this information is available to a potential attacker, it vastly reduces the amount of work that an attacker has to do in order to successfully break into the system. In this example, if we're told that a password must be exactly 8 characters long and cannot contain any special characters, then we have no need to search for passwords of length 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, or for passwords of length 9, 10, 11, etc. Furthermore, if we're designing a brute force attack, we would have no need to include special characters in our password generating algorithm. Since a standard English keyboard contains 32 special characters, or 33 special characters if you count the space key, then by eliminating these 32 or 33 special characters, we are further able to vastly reduce the password search space. Next, we'll talk about a few different types of approaches to cracking passwords, beginning with a dictionary attack. To begin, consider that most passwords used by humans are not random sequences of characters and numbers, but instead are combinations of normal words, proper names, acronyms, and so forth. The reason for this is that human beings have a great deal of difficulty in remembering random sequences of numbers and letters. Instead, we commonly use passwords such as Betty23 or Chocolate Frog, or some other combination of regular words, proper names, acronyms, numbers, etc. Recognizing that humans behave in this way, cracking a password does not necessarily require a brute force attack. Instead, we can use something called a dictionary attack. Now, a dictionary attack is simply where, instead of trying all possible combinations of characters, we instead use an intelligently designed list of possible passwords in order to break into an account. Although the name dictionary attack suggests that the items in the list come from a dictionary, say an English language dictionary, that term is actually a little misleading. Although the list could certainly contain all of the normal words that one would find in a regular dictionary, most dictionary attacks also use additional items such as proper names, names of celebrities, acronyms, lists of common passwords, etc. Even a very large list might only contain a few million possibilities, which, as we will see, is many, many, many orders of magnitude less than, say, a brute force attack. Another approach to cracking a password is to assemble a set of passwords that are likely for a specific user. And this attack is predicated on the notion that each unique person has characteristics that can be used to make their password easy to guess. That is, if an attacker invests the time to learn a little bit about you, he or she is much more likely to be able to guess your password. Consider this question. Are any of your passwords related to your life, your interests, your personal preferences? Examples of personal details that are useful for cracking passwords include things such as your family members' names, maybe your children's names or your parents' names or your spouse's name, birthdays, maybe the names of your pets, your favorite television shows, favorite foods, numbers, colors, maybe your first car, something derived from one of your hobbies, and so forth. As with a dictionary attack, if we gather enough personal information about a target, we can use that information to vastly reduce the search space when attempting to identify the password. One of the very troubling trends that has been noted by security experts of late is that much of this personal information is now voluntarily disclosed by people on their social networking pages. Thus, if a person has not properly configured their privacy settings and these types of personal details are publicly available, a password cracker could easily gather those details and use them in an effort to crack that person's password. After analyzing the passwords of a very large number of people, researchers were able to assemble this pie chart, which I think says something very important and very scary about the current status of password usage in the world. As shown in this chart, 2%, or about 1 out of every 50 passwords, uses only 2 characters. What's more, 14% of all passwords use only 3 characters. An additional 14% of all passwords use 4 characters, but with the additional constraint that all 4 characters are letters. 22% of all passwords use 5 letters, where all of those letters are of the same case, so all uppercase or all lowercase, for example. 19% of passwords use 6 lowercase letters, while a further 15% of all passwords are comprised simply of words in a dictionary or in a list of names. Together then, all of these groups total to 86% of all of the passwords used by human beings. From a security perspective, this is quite depressing, because even with modest computational capabilities, this means that 86%, or nearly 9 out of every 10 passwords, could be cracked in a relatively short period of time, simply by using the information shown here. Next, let's talk about a brute force attack. Now, a brute force attack, which is also called an exhaustive attack, employs a strategy in which we use a computer to try every possible combination of characters until the correct password is found. One of the most interesting traits of a brute force attack is that if the target system has no means of detecting or preventing a brute force attack, then given enough time, the attack will always be successful. That is, given enough time, we will always be able to find the correct password. The question then is precisely how much time will be required? And the answer to that question depends in large part upon the length of the password. As an example, consider that if a password is between 1 and 8 characters long and is comprised of upper or lowercase letters, that is, we have 26 letters in the English language, upper and lowercase gives us 52 possibilities for letters, and we add numbers to the set of possibilities. There are 10 possible numbers, 0 through 9, and special characters. On an English keyboard we have 32 special characters if we do not count the space key. Then in total we have 94 possible symbols that might be used in a password. Since we stated that the password is between 1 and 8 characters long, we can calculate the number of possibilities by taking 94 to the first power, plus 94 to the second power, plus 94 to the third power, and so on and so forth up to 94 to the 8th power. And the result of this calculation is about 6.1 times 10 to the 15th possible passwords. And this indeed is a very large number of passwords. From a statistical perspective, note that we will crack the password on average after having tried half of the possibilities. Just to impress upon you the nature of the exponential growth that occurs as we add additional characters to the length of our passwords, consider that if we used a 40-character password in this scenario, then the number of possible passwords would be greater than 10 to the 78th power, which is equal to the number of particles that comprise the known universe. Again, remember that making password standards public can be a security risk. If we know, for example, that a password is exactly 8 characters long, then in this scenario there are only 94 to the 8th power passwords, and we can immediately discard everything in the set below and above that, thus making the search space much, much smaller. Note that password-based security can be enhanced through a well-designed authentication system. As an example, a system might be designed such that after an incorrect password has been provided 3 times in a row, the system might lock the user's account, thereby requiring that the system administrator manually reset the password. As a less stringent, but still extremely effective strategy, each failed login attempt can be intentionally accompanied with a delay. For example, if after each failed login attempt, the programmer simply instructs the thread to sleep for 5 seconds, then at most only 12 login attempts can be made per minute. With this sort of strategy, testing trillions or hundreds of trillions of possible combinations is simply infeasible, and a brute force attack would simply require too much time in order to be worthwhile. When thinking about authentication mechanisms, consider that all authentication mechanisms use different combinations of just 3 things in order to establish a user's identity. First, an authentication mechanism might use something that the user knows. This, for example, could be a password, a personal identification number, a mother's maiden name, etc. Second, an authentication mechanism might use something that the user has, that is, a physical key, an ID badge, a driver's license, a security token, etc. Third, an authentication mechanism might rely upon something that the user is. For example, it might use voice recognition or biometrics to identify a specific human being. And if we want to improve the strength of our authentication process, we can simply combine two or more of these authentication mechanisms. In the past few decades, we've seen rapid growth in the use of biometric authentication, so I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss biometrics and their implications for authentication systems. Broadly speaking, biometrics involves the use of a physical or biological characteristic of a human body in order to authenticate a user. And this mechanism of authentication is predicated upon the assumption that the characteristic being measured is unique to each human body. Examples of physical or biological characteristics that are used for authentication include things such as fingerprints, voice pattern recognition, retinal scans, face recognition, hand recognition, DNA, etc. A very critical question from a privacy perspective is this: should a government be able to require that every citizen provide it with biometric data, such as fingerprints or a DNA sample? This is a very critical question from the perspective of personal privacy. Consider, for example, that passwords can change. You can change your password on most systems at almost any time. That is, a password is not permanently linked to you as a physical human being. Biometric data, however, such as your fingerprints or your DNA code, is a permanent part of who you are at the deepest level. And once you give this information up, once your fingerprints or your DNA profile or other biometric data is sitting in some corporate or government database somewhere, you have forever lost a certain type of privacy. And the increasing demand of governments for their citizens or foreign visitors to provide this kind of information is, in my opinion, quite alarming. Your views, of course, may be very different from mine. Aside from these philosophical concerns, there are other problems with biometrics to which I would like to draw your attention. First among these are psychological issues. Certain people, for example, simply fear using biometric devices, and these fears might be rooted in physical harm. For example, perhaps the laser from a retinal scanner will cause permanent damage to my vision. Or, as I noted previously, some of these fears are related to perceived losses in privacy. In the modern era, many of the things that George Orwell wrote about his imagined Big Brother have turned out to be remarkably prophetic. On the other hand, there are also tangible problems with biometric authentication. For example, the measurement devices are expensive. Further, they're not 100% accurate and have built-in tolerances for inaccuracies. These built-in tolerances can produce false positives and false negatives. Further, biometric equipment can fail, and this potentially might bring an organization to a grinding halt. Imagine, for example, a future in which your passage through airport security requires that you successfully go through a retinal scan. From a practical perspective, what happens to this airport security process if one day the retinal scanners fail? What's more, forgeries of biometric information are quite possible. It was established by Japanese researchers that it is remarkably easy and remarkably inexpensive to fabricate false fingerprints which will fool the majority of fingerprint scanning devices. But more broadly speaking, in order for biometric authentication to become widespread, the equipment for conducting biometric authentication must be made commercially available. This means that would-be attackers can simply purchase the equipment, study it, learn how it works, and in the process, learn how to circumvent it. When it comes to identification and authentication in computer security, then, the strategy which will provide the greatest level of security is to adopt multifactor authentication. In multifactor authentication, we use a combination of authentication mechanisms or data as the basis for recognizing a user. We might, for example, combine a traditional password authentication mechanism with a biometric scanner of some kind. Or we might pair a password with temporal access limitations, which restrict the times of the day in which the password will function. Further, we can impose geographic access limitations. That is, perhaps our passwords will only work on systems within a specific building, or on machines operating within a range of IP addresses, and so forth. From a practical perspective, however, realize that although adding additional authentication mechanisms can improve the security of the overall authentication process, doing so also increases the inconvenience of those who must authenticate themselves to the system, and it also increases costs and managerial overhead. As an example of multi-factor authentication, consider the example shown here, which uses the combination of something that a user knows and something that a user has in order to perform the authentication process. In this case, in addition to a login name, the user must also supply a passcode, where the passcode is a combination of a personal identification number, that is, something that the user knows, plus a token code, which in this case is a 6-digit code that is generated by a keyring-based security token. Each user in this scenario would be given a security token which contains something called a unique seed. That seed, in combination with the current time and a proprietary security algorithm, generates a 6-digit code which changes regularly, in this case once every 60 seconds. This effectively creates an authentication process in which the user's passcode changes once per minute, thereby vastly improving the overall security of the system and making any attempts at impersonation through an automated or brute force attack essentially infeasible. Well, my friends, thus ends our discussion of identification and authentication. I hope that you learned something interesting in this lesson, and until next time, have a great day.